technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome to Point of View and happy Monday. I'm so glad that you are with me listening to Point of View today. It's always an honor to be here with you as well. Man, there is a lot of news to talk about, as there always is over the weekend, and we'll try to get to as much of it as we can. Also have an interview coming up later, so let me preview the topics a little bit for you today. In the second hour, I'm going to be interviewing Richard Lim. He's a friend of Point of View on the program frequently. You'll recognize him from the Roundtable. And we're going to discuss Iran specifically from a historical perspective. Richard Lim is, I like to call him, our resident history expert, and he'll have some insight that he can offer us that I think might be helpful in understanding what's going on today. Also, you may be being asked to use AI at work. In fact, a lot of people are. We've heard a lot of promises about how effective it's going to be, but there's some data out now telling us exactly how it's impacting employees. So I think it might be relevant to you. You might be interested in that. We'll get to that and more in the second hour. But for now, let's do a little bit of a pro-life update. As you know, if you listen to Point of View, this is an issue that is close to my heart, and it's something that we really need to be aware of. And so first, some news out today. This is from the National Review. I didn't get it posted at pointofview.net, but you can follow along with our other topics there. And let me just remind you, if you want to ask a question or make a comment about anything we're discussing today, you can do that as we are on the show live at Facebook or YouTube, and just leave a comment or a question, and then we can read it out during the show, and that'll be a fun way for us to interact. So feel free to do that. But this is the latest news from National Review again. So the Trump administration's DOJ has actually moved to dismiss a lawsuit from Texas and Florida over the abortion pill. So let me break this down. You may remember last fall, the Trump administration actually approved a generic version of mifepristone, which is the abortion pill. And by the way, that's what is responsible for the majority of abortions in the United States right now. And we've talked about that here on Point of View a lot. And so Texas and Florida actually sued the FDA over that, saying that there are so many problems. We're going to get into some of those specifically here in a moment. So many health risks for women. It is not safe. If you look at the history of the abortion pill, which I have documented in a booklet that you can request from Point of View, it was rushed along every single bit of the way, including starting in the year 2000 under President Bill Clinton. And then more safeguards were eliminated under the Biden administration during COVID. And of course, it's killing unborn children, and it's very harmful to women as well. And the Trump administration had promised to do another safety review to actually reevaluate whether or not it should be approved under the FDA. Well, instead of doing that, they approved a generic version of it. And now there was some back and forth with them saying, hey, this was already in process. We can't really stop that. But Texas and Florida are two states who, after Roe, they said, hey, abortion's illegal in our states now, but the abortion pill keeps being mailed over. And so now this is going to be made even easier with another version of the pill. You know, the state said, I don't think so. But now the FDA is actually, or the DOJ is moving to dismiss those lawsuits from states that have been very supportive to the Trump administration. So this is from Marjorie Dannenfelser. She's the president of the SBA Pro-Life America, which is a wonderful pro-life organization. She says, it's a disgrace that pro-life states like Florida and Texas are having to fight the Trump-Vance administration in court to uphold their laws, and that extremists like Gavin Newsom are being allowed to dictate their policy. And what she means by that is, again, so many abortion pills are being ordered online, mailed from states where it is legal into states where it's not, and this is just proliferating under the Trump administration. And so over 80% of Republicans, by the way, feel that the FDA should at least require an in-person appointment before physicians can dispense the abortion drugs, but that was lifted during COVID, and that's not happening right now. So again, just a little update. You can go to National Review online, and you can see the full report on that, because it is of concern that despite having a very, I'll be honest, pro-life record overall in his first term, the Trump administration does not really seem to be listening as well as pro-lifers would like when it comes to the abortion pill. So thankfully, there are other people in Washington, D.C. who do care about this issue, and one of them is Senator Josh Hawley, who, as you know, is a Republican from Missouri. And so last week, he actually introduced new legislation, the Safeguarding Women from Chemical Abortion Act. And I actually have a clip of him introducing that. So if we can go ahead and play that first clip.
Thank you all for being here. It is such a privilege to have all of you here today. We are here today to issue a call to action, to call on the United States Congress to stand up and to protect the innocent unborn, to protect the health and safety of women whose lives are endangered by the abortion drug known as mifepristone. And we're also here to call on Congress to stand up to the greedy foreign corporations who are making billions of dollars in profits by endangering women's health and shipping to them a drug that they know is dangerous, that they know will cause the most devastating health effects, and they do it anyway because profit for them comes before people. It's time for Congress to take action.
I totally agree. And so maybe this is something that we can do a future action alert on, but even if not, you can go ahead and contact your senators and your state legislatures as well, anywhere that you have representation, and say, we need to do something about this. So 63% of all abortions are taking place now with chemical abortion, otherwise known as the abortion pill. And so if the Trump administration isn't going to reevaluate the FDA's approval of the abortion pill, then maybe that can be accomplished through this act. As the press conference last week noted, it highlighted the testimonies of some women who said, look, I was misled. This is not safe. It is not easy. It's traumatizing. So many women have been sent to the ER, had complications. Again, there are really no safeguards about this. And so why does it keep being approved? Why do safeguards that existed originally, then weren't even enough then, why do they keep being eliminated? Well, Senator Hawley had some thoughts about that as well.
Over the years, one liberal administration after another, President Obama and then President Biden, removed almost all of the safety protocols around mifepristone, such that today it is almost wholly unregulated. They did this for one simple reason, and it had nothing to do with protecting women's health, just the opposite. They did it because of abortion politics. They did it because they wanted to turn mifepristone into the driver of abortion on demand. And we have to admit today they largely succeeded. There are more abortions now in the United States than there were when Roe versus Wade was the law of the land.
And that is the sad truth that as pro-lifers, we need to reckon with. So again, that's the Safeguarding Women from Chemical Abortion Act. You can read more about that at pointofview.net. But if we really want to tackle the abortion issue now, the next wave of the battle, we have to tackle the abortion pill, otherwise known as chemical abortion. And so acts like this can help us do that. But we also need to be intentional about raising the next generation to be pro-life. So we're about to go to a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about some ways that the church and Christian parents can make sure that they are being intentional about raising children with pro-life values. So stay with us. We'll be right back on Point of View.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Will artificial intelligence replace your job? The answer to that important question depends on the type of job you have and how fast AI is implemented in society. Mario Loyola reminds us of a Karl Marx quote, "The production of too many useful things results in too many useless people." He lived through the Industrial Revolution and saw menial jobs being replaced by machines. The AI revolution could replace a significant percentage of entry-level jobs. Personal computers have enhanced your ability to work. AI has the potential to replace you entirely. AI can draft contracts, analyze financials, write code, and perform all sorts of functions usually undertaken by new business employees or junior lawyers. In the case of customer service, AI chatbots can handle all the routine questions, leaving just a few tasks for humans to step in to process more complex or emotional issues. Different studies come to different conclusions about AI job loss. One study, for example, found employment already declining since the release of ChatGPT. Another found less of an impact because of the loss of jobs was replaced by an increase in posting for other jobs. Perhaps the greatest impact will be on the economy itself. Some economists are predicting that the increased efficiency from AI will create real economic deflation. This could have a negative impact on our debt-based economy, suggesting that government officials would want to expand liquidity to prevent a deflationary spiral. Disruption will take place in the next few years. We need to be prepared for this new technological age. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, if you missed the first couple minutes of the show today, go to pointofview.net, read the article posted. It's from the Washington Stand about Senator Josh Hawley introducing the Safeguarding Women from Chemical Abortion Act. We just played a couple of clips from him. It's a very important piece of legislation if we are going to tackle the problem that is the abortion pill. But another thing we have to do, and we have to be intentional about as pro-lifers, as Christians, as parents, as ministry leaders and Sunday school teachers, pastors, etc., we must be intentional about really helping the next generation understand why this issue matters so much. So there's another article posted at the website, pointofview.net. Don't forget, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them while you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube. But this is from the Gospel Coalition, How to Raise Pro-Life Kids in 2026. And there are kind of some shocking statistics in here. So I'm going to just read out a few of these statistics from the article. Last year, a study found that the percentage of regular churchgoers identifying as pro-life plummeted from 63% in 2023, so that would be a majority, to 43% in 2025. So only 43% of regular churchgoers in America, according to the latest data that we have, identify as pro-life. That's a problem. And the thing is, that actually matches the percentage of pro-life people in the general population. So that means that we can't even say anymore that people who regularly attend church in America are more likely to be pro-life than people who don't. And here's another thing. That same study found that about 20% of regular churchgoers had paid for, encouraged, or chosen to have an abortion. We know, and we have known, that abortion is much more common than a lot of people would like to think. It's often, we've talked about this on the show, it's something that is really traumatic and emotional for women, and 1 in 4 women have had an abortion statistically, including in the church. And so in addition to talking about why it's important to be pro-life, we should also be talking about how to heal and recover, and for women to be able to come forward and receive that healing that they need from that. And we've talked about some ministries that do that. But again, what we're seeing now is that there is no significant correlation between being born again, how often you attend church, or how frequently you read the Bible, and the likelihood of having had an abortion or even identifying as pro-life. So again, that's from the Gospel Coalition. They're reporting on this study that was done. And so this is where we say, okay, we need to figure out, like, whatever we were doing to raise people to be pro-life and to instill these values in the next generation doesn't seem to have been very successful. And so the article actually interviews Herbie Newbell. He is the director of Lifeline Children's Services. They offer counseling for unplanned pregnancies, support for at-risk families. They offer adoption services, so great pro-life organization. And he also has raised his kids while working in this ministry. And so he really goes into, in this interview, some tips for parents on how to raise pro-life kids. And I think it's important. So let's go over some of those tips. He says parents must be intentional about teaching a gospel sexual ethic and a gospel family ethic. And as we know from Deuteronomy 6:7, we need to be talking about the Lord's teachings when you're walking, when you're laying down, when you're waking up, all throughout the day. This has to infuse our lives as Christians wherever we are. And if we ask ourselves, okay, how often, whether in the course of grandparenting or parenting or even just being around my own sphere of influence, how often am I talking about the Lord? How often am I talking about the Word of God or helping those in conversation with me? How often am I helping them come to a more biblical understanding of a certain topic? And if the answer is, well, not very much, or we talk about God when we pray over meals or before bed, then okay, maybe we need to be doing better and start specifically. So we need to start early. And this can be at, when kids are very young. You can show them pictures of whenever mom was pregnant. You can point out other people in your life, friends and family members who are expecting children, and talk about the value of the baby inside the womb. You can personify the baby because, as we know from a biblical perspective, the baby is a person, and be intentional about talking about the baby that way. And you can read passages of Scripture like the Psalms that talk about how God knit us together in our mother's womb. And so we can be intentional about, even at a very young age, at the toddler stage, starting to instill those values in that understanding of personhood that starts right at the very beginning of life. And you may remember, if you listened a couple months ago, I interviewed Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and she wrote a book, Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design. Such a great book, and she really gave a lot of tips for this, so I would look that book up or search that book on the Point of View website and find that interview if you missed it. But this is something that is mentioned in this article as well, that when it's age appropriate, talk to your kid about sex. And of course, age-appropriate levels, but if we're not instilling a biblical worldview understanding of a biblical sexual ethic from a young age, the reality is that in today's day and age, whether from media or just friends, even family members, certainly at public schools, they are going to get an alternate message. They're going to get a secular message that goes against what the Bible has to say about marriage or parenthood and what it looks like to live that out. And so we can be proactive at age-appropriate levels from the very beginning, instilling in a positive way the positive message of the goodness of God's design. And that's one of the ways that we can also contribute to a pro-life generation as well. And so it's also good, too, like we don't want to overly shelter them. So this is another point that the article makes, is that you can talk about different lifestyles. They're going to be exposed to them, but we can say, in the safe environment when you are raising kids, when they're under your care as a parent or when they're in the church, that's the time to have those conversations and allow them to ask tough questions about what they're seeing in the culture. And again, we have to realize that they're encountering it even before we realize it. So we have to address it and encourage them to ask the questions. So this goes into, again, the media that they're looking at. I mean, again, Covenant Eyes is a great organization, but it tells us that 75% of Christian men and 40% of Christian women are consuming pornography regularly. and that kids are exposed at a very young age. And all of this goes together because if we want to really raise a generation that is pro-life, we have to start with the fundamentals of what God teaches about the family and about valuing every single person and every human being as somebody who is valuable and made in the image of God. So we can talk about marriage. We can encourage them to ask questions and to have those conversations with them. But this isn't something that we can just assume that they will pick up from us if we aren't explicitly talking about it. And I think that is the problem that sometimes we might make, even with good intentions, is we have values as churches or as ministry leaders. We have values as parents, but we really need to be intentional and explicit about passing them on to our kids because we had an interview on this last week. I interviewed the authors of the book, The Culture of God's Word. And the reality is, maybe a few decades ago, you could kind of assume that people were going to pick up basic biblical values or Christian values from the culture because they were popular. And maybe we got a little lax, and that's just not the case anymore. And so we have to be very intentional. And one of the things, too, and I thought this was a great point, and I kind of want to end with maybe talk about this before we move on to another topic, is that when you are trying to instill a pro-life values in your children, in the next generation and teens, that doesn't mean overly sheltering them necessarily because they are going to run into single parents. Or maybe you feel if you're a single parent, say, well, maybe I messed up in this regard. How can I teach those values to my kids? And that's actually very powerful because so much of what drives young women to abortion is a sense that they don't have help or a sense of shame. And then that can lead them into the arms of abortion providers like Planned Parenthood and the abortion politics like Senator Hawley talked about, who are saying that this is empowering, this is the only option for you. As Christians, we need to say, no, there are other options. We want to come around you in this time. We want to give you love and support. And there are some organizations that do that. One of them is Embrace Grace. I've actually led Embrace Grace groups at my church before. And so if that's something that is on your heart, then I would check them out. That's an action item that you can take today, is to make sure that single women in your community feel loved and supported. We want to make sure that the church is the place that they are running to, not the place that they are running away from. So check out that article. It's at pointofview.net on how to raise pro-life kids in 2026. This is so important. The abortion fight is not over in America. And so in addition to political action that we can take and tackling things like the abortion pill, as Christians, we need to be teaching about this from the very beginning. We're about to go to a break, but when we come back, we are going to talk about a great resource that will help us combat the loneliness epidemic. And that is the book Unknown: Finding Connection in a Disconnected World. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Well, we all know that there is a loneliness epidemic, but how do we combat it? And more specifically, how do we forge real, meaningful connection in our own lives? Well, we're going to talk about that. We've got a book. You can find the link to it at pointofview.net. Unknown, Finding Connection in a Disconnected World by Keith Spurgin. Keith, it's great to have you on Point of View today. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So Keith Spurgin is an author, international speaker, and the president of Growth Resourcing Group, an organization dedicated to helping leaders, pastors, and business owners lead better than ever. He's also a husband, father, and a friend, and he's the founder of New Hope Church in Wiley, Texas. So we're kind of in the same neck of the woods, Keith. But I wanted to just ask, first of all, again, as I mentioned, we know that there's kind of a connection problem in our world today, but specifically, why was this message on your heart when you wrote this book?
Well, I work with leaders all over the world, and one of the things I run into over and over again is leaders who are lonely. And it's almost a catchphrase, leadership is lonely or it's lonely at the top. But, God's not lonely and he's at the top. So I think we've got a wrong way of thinking about leadership, how we think about life. We tend to be really isolated in the West, Western civilization. And I think God has a better plan for us. So that was part of what drove it. And then my own experience as well with a season of loneliness and isolation that I just had to write this book.
And I was wondering, too, if you could kind of share some of your personal experience in that story, because, for somebody who's been through that, I think maybe there's a lot they could relate to.
Absolutely, Liberty. I'm happy to share it. When I was 34, I started my first organization, which was a church, and it took off. It was one of those, we get going and everybody seems to be coming, and it just really ramped up really fast. It was super exciting. And, I had people calling me from around the world asking for advice and how do I build teams? How do I build momentum? How do I do what you're doing? And I thought to myself, I've made it, I'm doing it, here I am. And a few years into that, my wife, who was part of this and huge part of the team, we were doing it together. She looked at me one day and she said, I feel like you have a mistress. And it rocked my world, because if anybody would have asked me, who's the most important human in your life, I would have said, my wife, Susan, of course. But she didn't feel that way. And that led into a season for both of us of just feeling really disconnected and isolated from each other. I was really dazed and confused by it all because I thought I'm building this organization to help people connect with God and other people. And yet I'm feeling lost and alone and isolated. And I had a really good friend who walked away from our ministry at that time, and it was really, really difficult. So I just had to do a whole big reevaluation of how I'm doing life. And I came to realize that, we can put all this stock into all these things that we think mark success, whether it's spiritual success or financial success or political success or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, if our relationships aren't healthy, none of it means anything. It's all just dead. And so that was a huge thing for me. And we spent a couple of years reestablishing our relationship. My wife and I went on a short sabbatical. And I'm happy to say we're 38 years into marriage now and happier than we've ever been. But wow, we have had some rough times, and I'm thankful for that relationship now.
Yes. And one of the things that I love about your book is that part 2, which we'll focus on that here in a moment, is really focused on very practical things that anybody can implement. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just very helpful because we can say, well, we need more connection or you need relationships. But like you said, in Western civilization, and I think America, and we can even get smaller, Texas specifically, I'm a native Texan. Yeah. We're very independent. And if somebody, maybe they think I'm okay, But I really love that you highlighted this goes back to how God designed us. And if we want to know how to flourish in life, we have to understand our design. So can you talk about the relational aspect of how God designed us?
Yeah, we know we're made in the image of God, right? And God is a perfect, triune, symbiotic relationship, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And he says, you're made in my image. So that means we are made for relationship, and we're made for healthy relationship. We're made for deep connection with one another. And so often we just don't have that. Surveys tell us that about 50% of Americans feel isolated. They don't feel connected. That's just going against the grain of how we're designed by God. Jesus said the first two commandments are both relational. Love God, love your neighbor. Those are both relationships, and so that it is the basis of the kingdom of God, really, is relationship with God, relationship with each other. So when we don't have that, we're just really operating in the opposite of God's design for our lives. And I tell this story in the book, but I'll just tell it real quick. One day we were talking about Texas. It was a hot summer August day. I was mowing my yard, and I got done, and I was so excited about jumping in my pool. I ran toward my pool and left the ground. And about the time my foot left the side of the pool, I realized my phone was in my pocket.
Oh, no.
And there was no turning back. I hop out of the pool. I take the phone apart, try to dry it out. That phone was never the same because it wasn't designed to be submerged in water. And we're not designed for the isolation and disconnection that so many of us live in our lives. So, yeah.
That's a great insight. And what I love about Jesus is that he demonstrated what a human life is supposed to look like by taking on human form and then living that demonstration for us. And you say that with, maybe we don't really think about how human Jesus is. And he had relational needs as well and really exemplified how to build that. And so maybe talk about that for a little bit, just how Jesus himself had relational needs.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that because I love that part. One of the first things Jesus did when he starts his ministry is he builds a team around him. And and he took it really seriously. Like it says, he went out and prayed all night about who's going to be on my team, who is my inner circle. And then he had an inner circle inside of the inner circle of Peter, James, and John, who got to experience things with him that nobody else got to experience. And of course, in the garden, when he's at his most desperate moment of greatest human need, he calls Peter, James, and John and says, hey, you guys come over here with me. I want you to be with me in my deepest agony. And he was so vulnerable with those guys. And so often I think for us is we're scared of vulnerability because we think, oh, I'll be rejected or whatever. And we don't build healthy inner circles of people because we've been hurt along the way. I mean, I get it. We all get hurt in relationships. But because of the hurt and the pain, we put these little walls up and we distance ourselves from people. And so then because we're designed for connection, we're like, okay, well, I'll try another relationship. And this can be friendships, business partnerships, romantic relationship, whatever. So we have a little wall up because we got hurt. Now I try to build another relationship with somebody else, but I'm not really all in because I'm holding part of myself back because I don't want to get hurt again. Then the person, they feel that, and then there's more pain for both of you, and then more distance, and then we wonder why we're so isolated. Why am I not close to anybody? Well, because you have all these walls up around you, and you've got to take those walls down. And the only way to take a wall down in a relationship is to be vulnerable. You don't take walls down in relationships by putting up more walls or pretending or hiding or denying or acting like you don't feel pain. It's only in our vulnerability, just like Jesus exemplified in the garden. And we say, man, this is how I really feel. This is what's really going on. It's what I often call just have the conversation, the one that you've been wanting to have. I don't know who this is for out there, but the conversation you've been wanting to have with the person that you've just been resisting having it, have the conversation. that sense of knowing you need to have a conversation is probably the Spirit of God prompting you. And I know it's vulnerable and I know it's scary, but that's the only way to take walls down, and that's the only way to have the kind of relationship that you really want, is by initiating vulnerability.
Yes, such a good word, and I hope that somebody takes that to heart. And when we come back, because we're about to have to go to a break, we'll really discuss that even deeper. Okay, so how can we build trust? How can we be vulnerable? How can we find these meaningful connections and really foster those in our lives? And this is so important. And as Christians in the church, we should be leading the way in this and exemplifying this kind of relationship for the world. So we're talking with Keith Spurgin. He's the author of Unknown: Finding Connection in a Disconnected World, and we'll have more on the book when we get back from this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're back with Keith Spurgin, who is talking to us about his new book, Unknown: Finding Connection in a Disconnected World. And just a reminder that when we come back in the second hour, I'll be talking with Richard Lim about a historical perspective on U.S.-Iran relations, and I think that'll be helpful for us as we watch the news, and we'll talk about some other news items as well. But let's keep talking about how we can build connection. We talked about how this is so important for human beings because it's how we were designed in the image of God to have these meaningful relationships. And so the second half of your book really delves into, okay, how do we do that? How do we go deeper in our relationships? And I will just note that studies show, Keith, that people aren't necessarily less lonely when they're surrounded by a lot of people, but it really is the meaningful relationships where you can be real
Right.
and have that vulnerability, that's really what helps people to feel connected. And one of the things you talk about for that is trust deposits. So tell us what that is.
Yeah. Well, relationships are built on trust. I mean, if you don't have trust, you don't really have a relationship. You might have an acquaintance or you might have an enemy, but you don't really have a connection, if there's no trust. So trust is really the foundation that we build on. And so, in any relationship, you want to be making those trust deposits on a regular basis, because we're all going to make mistakes and we're going to make trust withdrawals sometimes. And so we want to be building that trust account up so that when we do have to make a withdrawal, it doesn't diminish the whole account, and the whole relationship goes to zero or negative in some cases. But it's challenging because we're imperfect humans. But it's simple things. How do we build trust? Do what you say and say what you do. Keep a job. Show up. Lean in rather than leaning away. Just do the work in the relationship. If it's a really important relationship in your life, you want to become a student of the other person. I always say, I want to be the greatest expert on Susan Spurgin in the world. I want to know her personality. I want to know her gifts, her traits, her strengths, her weaknesses, so that I can meet her at her point of need. That builds trust when we do that with people, when we make our lives more about them than about ourselves. Speaking of a biblical concept,
Yes.
Philippians 2, right? And it's so often in our culture today, everything is about us. Give me more, give me this, give me that, entitlement, I want this. Relationships don't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's called dysfunction for a reason. When it's all about me, immediately the relationship starts to deteriorate. So I build trust by making the relationship about the other person. And when you have two people doing that, a relationship starts to flourish. Mm-hmm. If you only have one person doing it, like if you say, well, I'm the person who's always building trust, the other person doesn't do that, well, that tells you something about how far that relationship can go. Mm-hmm. That's good information. I always tell people that's good to know, because now you can say, okay, well, I can only go so far with this person.
Yeah.
But if the other person is also building trust and investing, then okay, we can take it to the next level. Mm. So that's what I mean by building trust and making trust deposits.
I think that's so helpful too. And one of the things you talked about as well is to kind of have a priority list. And that doesn't mean that we aren't loving and respectful toward everybody in our lives, but even Jesus had an inner circle. And so I think that was helpful, as well as, like you said, you're going to make mistakes, but you talked about really your trust account is how are you characterized, because no one's going to be perfect. And if you have a deficit or a negative in your trust account, then that's when you're characterized as being untrustworthy versus being characterized as being trustworthy. And so let's talk about vulnerability a little bit more. I know you talked about that a few minutes ago, but there was a really powerful connection too with what the Bible teaches about bringing things to the light. And I really liked that analogy in terms of being transparent in our relationships.
Yeah, 1 John chapter 1 in verse 7, John really inspires and encourages us to step into the light as God is in the light. And he says there's two things that happen from that. Your fellowship with one another grows deeper, but also your relationship with God goes to the next level, which is so true. People often think the opposite, though. It's counterintuitive for us because we think, if I'm vulnerable, if they really know who I am, then they won't like me anymore, or they'll think this of me, or if they know where I came from, or if they knew my past, I find the exact opposite to be true most of the time. I think that's just, honestly, a lie from the enemy, that we tend to believe that, if I share, they're going to reject me. And some people will. There are a small percentage of people that will. But again, that tells you about that relationship and how far you can go. But think about the light. When he says step into the light, what does light do? Well, light reveals what is in the darkness. And if we think about that in relational terms, when I step into vulnerability, I'm stepping into the light. Well, we know that God operates in the light, the enemy operates in the darkness. So when I step into the light, I am opening myself up to the goodness of God in my life. God is able to do what he wants to do in me. He's able to heal me and restore me and refresh me. When I hide in the darkness, when I keep everything hidden, we all know this is how shame works. If we hold back and we keep everything hidden, then that's the enemy's playground. He's just eating us up from the inside out. But when we open ourselves up vulnerably, and you don't do this the first time you meet somebody, that would be weird, right? That's crazy. But over time, we share a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of ourselves. And if the other person responds well and they share a little bit more of themselves, that tells you, okay, I can take the next step. We can go a little bit farther. And this is how healthy relationships are built this way.
Yeah.
And can I say one more thing about that?
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
Okay, Liberty?
Yeah, we got a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Because, and I'll just start off by saying it this way: there is no passion without risk. And you think about it this way: if you ever ask people what kind of relationships, what kind of words describe the most important relationships in your life, what do you want them to look like? Nobody ever says, "Man, I hope my most important relationships are boring and stagnant and stale and awful." Nobody says that. When they say, "Man, this is the kind of relationship I want," they say things like, "Man, I want it to be adventurous. I want it to be exciting. I want it to be fresh. I want it to be alive." Those are all words of passion. But you don't get passion without risk. And that in relationships is an absolute truth. You just don't. Sometimes people will come to me and they'll say, "Oh man, my relationship with God has just gotten so stale and so stagnant." And my first question is always, when is the last time you took a risk with God? When is the last time you stepped out in faith, and if God didn't show up, you were going to fall flat on your face? Because I promise you, if you step out like that, there's going to be a lot of passion in your prayers. There's going to be a lot of passion in your worship. There's going to be a lot of passion in your heart toward God because you need him.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we stop risking in relationships, and our relationships grow cold and stale and boring because we're not risking anything anymore.
Yeah.
If you think about like a young couple that's romantic couple, and they're all passionate and they can't get off the phone with each other and they're all lovey-dovey and everybody wants to throw up. And then you see them a few years later and they've lost that spark. I will guarantee you somewhere along the way, one or both of them stopped risking their heart.
Keith, that's a great word. And we are running out of time, but I just want to encourage people to check out this book. You can go to pointofview.net and find Unknown: Finding Connection in a Disconnected World by Keith Spurgin. And it has questions in the back. It's perfect for a small group or to read with your spouse or your friend. This is a great resource for building connection. We'll be right back with more after these important messages.
It was President Ronald Reagan who said, "I wonder sometimes why we won't recognize that one book could solve a lot of problems for us." He was talking, of course, about God's Word. It holds the solution to our problems because it holds the truth. Did you know that between 2024 and 25, there was a surge in Bible reading among Americans? At last, people are seeing through culture's lies. They're tired of the moral confusion. They're seeking truth that they can live by. March 23rd kicks off Truth Team Week, a special time when Point of View highlights the impact of Truth Team members on our culture. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can join the Truth Team today. Help Americans find the truth they need. Visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151 to learn more. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kirby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Liberty McArtor.
Thanks for sticking with us right here on Point of View. This Monday, we're going to talk about some news, specifically Iran. Let's get a historical perspective on U.S.-Iran relations. There's a lot of information that probably isn't being highlighted in the news right now. We'll also talk about the MAGA split that is apparently there over Iran, and much ado has been made of it in the media, but what do the numbers actually say? How do Republicans really feel about the Iran war? And then later on in the show today, to wrap up the hour, we'll talk about AI at work, how it might be affecting you and other employees around the nation. But talking about Iran right now is Richard Lim. You know him from the Roundtable. He's a frequent co-host and guest on Point of View. He hosts This American President and has regular media appearances elsewhere, and is, of course, a historical expert. So, Richard, thanks so much for being with us on Point of View today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I did want to acknowledge before we jump into some of these historical questions that we do need to be praying for our troops, because they are actively engaged, of course. And so last Thursday, you've probably seen the news, but 6 U.S. service members were killed when a refueling aircraft crashed in Iraq. So Central Command is saying that this loss was not due to hostile or enemy fire. It is tragic, and I know it leaves at least a few young families behind. So just a reminder, as we talk about these, never want to undermine the sacrifice that our troops and their families are making to defend freedom and to keep us safe. And so we want to acknowledge that. And a reminder, too, you can sign up at pointofview.net for our Pray for America emails. I write them. They go out every week. And it is just something we've been praying for Iran a lot lately, including the troops, Iranian Christians. So if you want to be united with other Americans in prayer for a specific purpose, then I encourage you to sign up for those. But Richard, you had a really excellent interview on your podcast, This American President, which I encourage people to look up, where you really talked about Iran-U.S. relations going even before the 1970s. And that everybody kind of talks about that. That's what we're familiar with, at least right now in the current news cycle, because the Shah was overthrown. That was the Islamic Republic of Iran really took power. But even before that, there was a long history of relations between U.S. and Iran, including in the Cold War. And so what are some important things that people need to know going back even further than the 1970s?
Absolutely. The United States and Iran have had a very critical relationship that had implications going back to the Cold War back, in the 1940s and 50s, all the way until the 1979 revolution. Iran is a critical, player in the entire Middle East region. So it's not surprising that the United States looked to have strong relations with Iran, especially with its large oil reserves during the Cold War. And the United States has had a profound influence on that country. It's very well known that the United States had taken part in the coup, which overthrew the Iranian leader in the 1950s, Mossadegh, in 1953. Of course, it's often used as an example of American imperialism, but at the same time, the United States had legitimate interests in the region vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and legitimate concerns about the pro-communist Tudeh party that had been prominent at the time, in addition to the fact that Mossadegh had also nationalized the oil industry and dissolved parliament and was basically a dictator in the making. President Nixon had a very close relationship with the Shah, and it was really Jimmy Carter who paved the way for the collapse of the regime in 1979 by softening support for the Shah. And if people look at what things were like under the Shah, the regime was authoritarian, but it was also a modernizing regime in which women had significant rights and access to education in various professions. But tragically, the Carter administration withdrew support, which paved the way for the current regime and all of the suffering that's happened over the past 46, 47 years.
And I think that that's really important for people to understand, too, is that history there and the culture and, like you said, the modernization that was happening prior to the late 1970s revolution that is affecting everything still now. And one thing that I thought was interesting, I noticed in the episode that you did that, you know, the U.S., as opposed to the Soviet Union or even the British Empire, was not really seen as imperialist to Iran. Like there was kind of a mutual friendship there and a partnership before the radicalization. And so hopefully that is that something that you think maybe there's potential in the future? I mean, I know people are disputing whether or not this is really a regime change war, but is that something that you think is possible down the line, is to have a more effective friendship with Iran again?
Well, you know, it really depends on what happens to this regime. And the thing that we should know about it is that this isn't kind of your run-of-the-mill Muslim regime in the Middle East. There are many secular regimes that have been in the Middle East over the past half century. Iran is a millenarian government that they believe they have a very specific view of from Shiite Islam that believes that there is this 12th Imam, basically the equivalent of like a Muslim Messiah that will return but is currently hidden, and their regime governs on his behalf until he comes back. And this goes back to like the 9th century when this figure, this imam, supposedly disappeared. And they believe that conflict and upheaval can actually hasten his return. So they believe that war, people are asking, why is Iran shooting at its neighbors? Oh, that's such a dumb thing to do strategically. Well, they believe that bringing about more upheaval can bring the Mahdi's return. So this is a regime that doesn't operate on the usual kind of nation-state level. It's a regime that idealizes martyrdom. Whenever one of their figures dies, they are now martyrs. And it's a regime that believes that more chaos will bring about the end times. And so whether or not there's anything even close to a rapprochement between the United States and Iran will really depend on whether this regime is eliminated.
So many good things to talk about and information that you're sharing with us, Richard. We're about to go to a break, but we're talking about Iran with Richard Lim and kind of the history of United States and Iran relations even prior to the Iranian Revolution that we talk about in the late 70s. And obviously, we're going to continue talking about, okay, what about now? So when we come back, let's fast forward a little bit and we'll talk about the nuclear history of Iran. And there is, I think, some misinformation out there regarding why the U.S. is getting involved, what the nuclear threat really was prior to Trump's actions. And so let's see if we can get Richard's take on that and maybe set the record straight and clarify things a little bit. We'll also talk about what do voters actually think, including within the MAGA base and outside of it. Is that going to affect the midterms? Probably, but we'll see. We'll discuss it when we get back from this short break. Don't forget, if you want to take action, there's still time to take action on the SAVE Act. So we have an action alert out on that. And if you haven't contacted your senators, go to pointofview.net. And I would encourage you to take that action. You can also follow along with everything that we've been discussing at pointofview.net. Leave a comment or a question for Richard if you're watching live on Facebook or YouTube. We'll be right back after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Will artificial intelligence replace your job? The answer to that important question depends on the type of job you have and how fast AI is implemented in society. Mario Loyola reminds us of a Karl Marx quote, "The production of too many useful things results in too many useless people." He lived through the Industrial Revolution and saw menial jobs being replaced by machines. The AI revolution could replace a significant percentage of entry-level jobs. Personal computers have enhanced your ability to work. AI has the potential to replace you entirely. AI can draft contracts, analyze financials, write code, and perform all sorts of functions usually undertaken by new business employees or junior lawyers. In the case of customer service, AI chatbots can handle all the routine questions, leaving just a few tasks for humans to step in to process more complex or emotional issues. Different studies come to different conclusions about AI job loss. One study, for example, found employment already declining since the release of ChatGPT. Another found less of an impact because of the loss of jobs was replaced by an increase in posting for other jobs. Perhaps the greatest impact will be on the economy itself. Some economists are predicting that the increased efficiency from AI will create real economic deflation. This could have a negative impact on our debt-based economy, suggesting that government officials would want to expand liquidity to prevent a deflationary spiral. Disruption will take place in the next few years. We need to be prepared for this new technological age. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, so let's speed up a little bit and get a little more modern or more recent with our history. And let's talk about the nuclear history there. So there has kind of been a framing, Richard, this is actually an article, editorial in today's issue of the Wall Street Journal, The Real Nuclear History of Iran. So if you want to look that up and read along on the Wall Street Journal, you can. But I thought I'd get Richard's take. So the framing that we are hearing a lot in the media today is that Iran was contained by previous deals, for instance, Obama's infamous nuclear deal with Iran, and that now Trump has messed all of that up and ruined diplomacy, and now Iran is actually more likely to pursue nuclear weapons than they were before. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. The narrative you mentioned that, Iran had been contained is, I'm not going to use, the words I could use. It's basically total BS. And I think that it's important to remember that Iran, it's been said lately that we've been at war with Iran since 1979. And I don't want that to become a talking point because it's literally true. They took over America's embassy in 1979, held, Americans hostage there for over a year. It ruined Jimmy Carter's presidency. Well, Carter didn't respond, so he allowed it to ruin his presidency. Iran supported Hezbollah as it became the biggest terrorist killer of Americans prior to Al-Qaeda. Before Al-Qaeda, no terrorist group killed more Americans than Hezbollah. Iran supported them all throughout. Reagan in 1988 ordered an Operation Praying Mantis, wiped out Iran's entire navy because they were mining the Gulf. And, of course, Iran killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans in Iraq. post 2003. So this is real. This is a real war. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just the talking point. Regarding the Iranian nuclear program, they have never ceased for decades trying to build the bomb. And a major setback in the effort against containing Iran was in 2003 when the United States intelligence community, actually, I think it might have been in 2006. I can't remember, but it was during the later Bush administration. They basically said Iran had halted its nuclear program. This is completely wrong. And the reason the intelligence community said this was because they'd gotten so much flack for overestimating Iraq in the run-up to the Iraq war that they started lowballing their intelligence estimates because they didn't want to be responsible for another war in the Middle East. But nonetheless, they essentially gave the Iranians cover by saying they had halted the nuclear program when, in fact, Iran had just made it more covert. And then what did we do in response? Well, Bush had no justification to act as a result of that deal. He was also bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Obama then took over 2009 and responded with pure appeasement. His Iranian deal that he negotiated in 2005 was pure appeasement. The limits, there were sunset provisions on the nuclear deal, which is never good. You're essentially saying you don't get to build nuclear weapons until a certain date. This was actually worse. It said you could enrich to a certain extent, but you can't get to a certain level until 2031. Well, in 2015, 2031 seemed like a long time, from then. It's 5 years from now.
Yeah.
And not to mention that the sanctions were scheduled to end in 2025, so which has already passed. So that has been the response essentially by the Obama administration and then the Biden administration, to say nothing of the fact that both of those administrations were basically anti-Israel, which, is the nation that Iran is threatened to destroy. So that has unfortunately been the response. It's been pure appeasement, and it's led to the situation we have today where Iran believes it can just get away with whatever it wants to do.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for people to understand too. And so, it was the report that was really falsified, like you were saying, was 2007. And this is the detail from the Wall Street Journal. Iran's president called the report a gift from God because it was so misleading in regards to what they were actually doing in their actual activities. And so they had been continuing to enrich themselves up all the way up through then. And so this is what I think people really need to understand. And there was something else too that I thought maybe you could comment on, is that we kind of have been through this a little bit with North Korea. And, Bill Clinton in the 90s was trying to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon. That didn't really go so well. So are there any lessons or maybe connections people can draw if they just remember back a little bit further?
Absolutely. There's been this bizarre idea. You can trace it to whatever type of thinking you want. A lot of people call it liberal internationalism, but it's this idea that the United States, through incentives, can essentially change the heart of a regime. It's the same idea that allowed us to bring in China into the World Trade Organization during the Clinton years. It was the same idea that if you give our enemies a bit of a stake in the international community, if you get them involved economically with us, if we establish economic relationships, they've tried that with China. Sadly, the Israelis tried it with the Palestinians in Gaza, and they don't understand that you cannot change the heart of a regime, of terrorist groups, of a millenarian regime. These beliefs go deeper than external incentives, and in a situation like that, the only thing you can really do is either to have a very aggressive containment or to use force to prevent them from causing harm. And so I think it's a lot of these beliefs. And I think sometimes as Americans, we're kind of naive in the sense that, if you give people the right incentives, if you make trade with other countries, then we can kind of come to an understanding. That's a very American idea. And that's not something that applies in so many other ideologies, so many other civilizations.
Right. So, we learned this lesson with North Korea. President Clinton at the time wanted to trust the diplomatic process. And of course, as we know now, North Korea had lied and cheated and built the bomb anyways. And so I think you make a good point, Richard, that we really do have to live in the real world. And I will say, of course, would we rather there not be a war? Would we rather not have our troops involved in the Middle East again? Of course. But you do have to live in the real world, and you have to, there's a saying, when people tell you who they are, believe them. And like you said, since the 1970s, Iran has been at war with the United States. They say they want to wipe Israel out. And you know that that's not an empty threat, because they have been sponsoring terror. They were a huge sponsor behind the October 7th attack. And so they have made their intentions towards the United States well known as well. And so I think that this is important, because contrary to the narrative that we are hearing, it's not necessarily that the Trump administration, I think, is shooting for regime change, because that tends to not work out so well, like you said, if you don't acknowledge the real, ethos that a people or a nation has. But if you are trying to work diplomatically instead of showing force to people who have proved to be our enemies, then that seems to be a little bit where the frustration is. But we have a couple minutes and we'll come back and then we'll talk about this more. But any other takeaways historically, real quick, before we go to break, that you think is important for people to keep in mind with regard to this whole conflict?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that I think oftentimes historically we learn not necessarily the right lessons from what we've experienced. And since Vietnam, we've essentially had this idea that any form of military intervention will always result in not just a loss, but a quagmire for the United States. And it's also led people to believe that the United States should never get involved around the world. But if you look at the long history of the United States in intervention, I come from a country, the Philippines, that the United States intervened against Japan to liberate the Philippines. And I think you'll find that that defeat and quagmire isn't always the case. And I think you'll also find historically that if you don't address a threat, you might have to address them later on when they're more powerful. And that means we'll have to address them at a greater cost to ourselves. And so I think, we've already allowed the Iranian regime to get away with so much. And I think that if something were to happen, it would have to happen sooner rather than later, when they're relatively weak, vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Yeah, and that's another point, too, just to remember, is that this wasn't something that happened out of the blue. Iran has been significantly weakened. President Trump knows he's entering his lame duck era, so to speak. And so it seemed to me like a very calculated decision to say we have an opportunity to act, and that opportunity is now. And so hopefully that can be effective, and that's what we're praying for. But let's talk about, when we come back from the break, what do Americans actually think? We're hearing and seeing headlines in the media about a MAGA split. Maybe some influential podcasters have something to do with that. But when it comes to people who voted for Trump, what do they actually think about the Iran war? We'll talk about that when we get back.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
All right, back for a few more minutes with Richard Lim. We're discussing the historical perspective on Iran and the United States relations, but let's talk about whether there is support for President Trump's actions. And you may have seen some headlines saying that the MAGA base is really turning on Trump on this, or they feel betrayed. And let's dig into some of the numbers. This is an article that is posted at pointofview.net. It's from the Free Press, called "There Is No MAGA Split on Iran." And Richard, I'll read out some stats and then kind of get your reaction to them. But this is among all Republicans. Between, depending on which poll you're looking at, YouGov, CNN, NBC, all have recent stats out. Between 76 and 77% of all Republicans support the war in Iran. 15% oppose. And then among Republicans who don't identify as MAGA, so maybe you could think of those as maybe the ones that are a little more skeptical about Trump, you still have between, again, depending on what poll you're looking at, 54 and 63% in support, and the others opposing. Among Republicans who identify as MAGA Republicans, so these are Trump's voters, right? This is his base. Between 85% and 90% support the war in Iran, and 5% oppose. And this article makes the point, a group that is, quote, split approximately 85% to 5% isn't really split at all. So, Richard, is this partisan loyalty to Trump, do you think, among Republicans, especially the MAGA base, where they're just going to support whatever he's doing? Or do you think that this is indicative of maybe some of those beliefs about the U.S.'s role in the world?
Well, I've seen polls that literally say that the numbers that support the war, basically when they poll support for this conflict, it parallels almost exactly Trump's own personal approval or favorability ratings. And so what it seems like, if you like Donald Trump, there's a 95+% chance that you support this war, and vice versa. And so what that tells me, it tells me a few things. The first is that while there is kind of this prominent cadre of people who oppose the war, who do have a lot of listeners, what it tells me is that a lot of these listeners are people that, first of all, they're people that might listen to, let's say, the Candace Owenses of the world, Megyn Kelly, Tucker Carlson, but they don't necessarily agree with everything they say. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. It also tells me that a lot of their influence is kind of outsized. It's loud. People talk a lot about what Tucker Carlson says, but it's not necessarily indicative of strong support. It also tells me that that there are a lot of people that joined in supporting Trump in 2024, but they don't. Their support is kind of soft. It's a bit fickle, and they may not have. They don't necessarily support Trump in everything he does. They might join on to support Trump because they don't like something that is happening on the left. They're kind of this floating independent vote that isn't always necessarily a reliable pro-Trump vote. It might be enough to help him win the popular vote in 2024, but it's also the reason why Trump seems to poll under 45% as well. So I think as long as Trump has this strong, solid base of support that is going to, support him no matter what, there will be enough support for this war. It really patterns the type of support that he has in general, not just for this war, but his basic approval rating.
And something that I've heard people say kind of as a critique is that they would have liked, there are a lot of potential critiques in regards to Congress and needing to get approval from Congress first and all of that. But I have heard people say, and I would agree in general, that President Trump could have made a stronger case beforehand and really articulated the reasons. I think that Secretary Rubio has done a really good job, been very articulate immediately after the strikes. And so I'm curious as whether or not if they do that well and maybe do a better job of that going forward, maybe they can persuade some of those voters, like you said, who swung to Trump and maybe can really understand a little bit better. But one of the things that we are seeing is that among younger voters, so when we look at these numbers, again, overwhelmingly among Republicans supportive of Trump here, the younger voters, though, that are Republican or MAGA are more likely to oppose the war on the right. And so I know that Vice President Vance, that's not a prediction here, but Vice President Vance, who a lot of people are eyeing for the next presidency, he has been very notoriously skeptical of foreign intervention, or a little more hesitant maybe than President Trump is currently. So do you think that this is going to be a shift as the boomers age out of being the main base of Republican voters? Do you think we'll see more isolationist tendencies, or do you think that this is just youthful kind of opinions right now? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I would say that part of it also depends on the outcome of what happens here. JFK is famous for saying that victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. And so if things are perceived to have gone well, if Iran is disarmed and is reduced as any kind of malignant force in the region and in the world, and you can argue that it was a quote unquote success, I think Americans just move on very quickly from this kind of stuff. I mean, if Iran is effectively disarmed, people are going to forget about it and move on. And so I think it's possible that it really depends on the outcome. And the thing is also is that you mentioned this young demographic, young men, and a lot of them are tuned into the podcasts. But generations change over time. They change what they believe over time. People used to talk about how in the 1960s and 70s you had this hippie generation that quote unquote sold out in the 1980s during the Reagan era. And by selling out, they mean that they went and got married and got jobs and settled down and all that kind of stuff. And so I think you'd have to look at that generation as potentially dynamic and kind of open to different ideas that evolve over time. And yeah, so much of it I think will depend on the outcome of what happens.
Yeah, great points. I love your historical perspective on that you always bring. So, Richard, it's been great talking with you about all of this. And again, I appreciate your insight. But before we wrap up this segment of the conversation today, what specifically are you looking for when you're watching the news and you're seeing, what's going to happen? And like you said, so much of it depends on how it turns out. What are the main aspects that you're watching?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm really looking at, first of all, this regime has shown that it's intransigent. There's been no talks of potential, reforming of the regime or opening up or anything like that. So I think the question is, what is the level of escalation that Trump undertakes from now on? He bombed Carg Island over the weekend, and to some that was an escalation, but it was also a limited escalation because he didn't go for the oil infrastructure. He just went for the military installation. So I think the question is, to what extent does Trump continue to intensify the attacks? And will that ultimately lead to regime change, or if not regime change, a completely neutered Iranian government? Yeah. And I think that'll dictate how people will look at this conflict and the ultimate outcome.
Yeah, great point. So again, thanks, Richard, for being with us on Point of View today. I encourage everybody to check out his podcast, This American President, including the episode out where he talks about the history of Iran and the U.S. relations, and that's super helpful and a great resource as well. But before we take a break, and we have another break coming up, I did want to mention, too, when you are talking about this issue and when you're talking with other people who maybe have different opinions on Iran and maybe are more critical of U.S.-Israel relations and partnerships, this is out from Fox News. The Iranian regime is spreading anti-Israel propaganda on social media, and they have been for a long time. And this is not anything new. That's nothing surprising to us that should surprise us. But this is a report that across X, Blue Sky, and Instagram, there were connections with the IRGC claiming to be users from the United States, England, Scotland, or even Ireland, specifically criticizing Israel. And so when people, we've seen reports saying that the majority of people get their news from social media. And if that is what someone is doing that you're conversing with, then you might want to just encourage them to be a little bit skeptical, because so much of the content that we're seeing maybe is actually propaganda. We've seen that in the past from Russia, of course, but also from Iran or China. Add to that, there are also reports out about how the Iranian regime is actually using AI to create fake images and videos as well and spread them across social media. So always, and more than ever before, in this era of the digital age that we're in and people getting their news from social media, you have to double check what you're seeing. And if you're talking with someone about this, encourage them to check as well. You might just be seeing something that's not exactly true. But we'll be back with more right here on Point of View after this short break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
All right, back for a few minutes today. Thanks again for being with me here today on Point of View. Had some great conversations. If you missed the first hour, I talked with Keith Spurgin a little bit about his book, Unknown, all about finding connection in today's disconnected world. And if you missed that, the book has questions, discussion questions, and things like that at the end. So it'd be great for your small group, a great resource. You can find the link at pointofview.net. Also just wrapped up a conversation with Richard Lim on Iran. So if you missed that, go back and listen. You can always find Point of View shows that you missed at the website, pointofview.net, or on podcasts. So if you prefer to listen later on your own time, you can always do Point of View radio talk show anywhere you get your podcast. But let's talk about AI a little bit. This might be surprising to you unless you're one of these people that is actually using these, but 80% of employees are now using AI tools at work. And that has changed a lot because just 2 years ago, it was only 53%. And I want to talk about this because it is affecting so many people's lives. We are seeing it. I have so many stories from friends in all kinds of different fields where they're saying, okay, we're in this field, we're in this industry, we're at this kind of job. How can we incorporate AI, artificial intelligence, to make our work more productive? And that has been the promise, that AI is actually going to help make people more productive. And if you are listening to anybody who is kind of the terms are using AI optimist or AI doomer, and, don't want to get too into labels here. Hopefully we can be the AI truthful team. Let's just say that. We just want to look at what's the truth about these new tools that are becoming ubiquitous. But the AI optimist will say it is going to really usher in a new era of human creativity because it is going to make us so efficient at our work that it will actually allow us to have more free time because all these mundane things like checking email and doing spreadsheets or, all of those kind of administrative tasks or even other more complicated things like coding that you may be doing at work at a white-collar job, that AI will be able to do it so much faster. So, of course, if you look at polling, though, people are kind of worried about this because I think they're seeing, rightly so, that, well, hold on now, if AI can do all that, is it going to make my job easier or is it going to eliminate my job? And that's what a lot of people are also predicting and saying, and it's even starting to happen. However, the optimists have said that it could potentially usher in a 4-day work week. It could free people up for less time on those kind of mundane tasks and be able to do kind of more high-level thinking. I have some thoughts on that, but I'm just telling you what the AI optimists are saying. Elon Musk even said that in 20 years, AI will make work optional. Okay, well, before I even get into the study that's going to give us some real numbers, this is kind of what I had been thinking along those lines. Have you met America? Because we tend to have a very strong work ethic, which is a good thing. But if you look up the definition of workism, it's really work idolatry. And that's also a problem in our nation as well. Think about your job and think about where you work and your boss and just practice, even if you have a great job, practically speaking, is it likely that you would, if your work week got shortened to 4 days because of AI productivity, that you would continue to be paid the same amount or even retained as an employee? Or would you pay be cut because now there are these sophisticated AI tools and programs that people have to pay for? So even some of the things that they're saying in terms of, how this is all going to go so well and free up our lives, it doesn't really make sense if you just kind of understand the basic realities of work and capitalism and how it all functions. Well, now we actually have data. So this is an article you can follow along with at pointofview.net. It's from the Wall Street Journal. And this is the first big study like this out now that so many employees are using AI tools at work. AI isn't lightening workloads, it's making them more intense. And it says the technology is increasing the speed, density, and complexity of work rather than reducing it. So this is an analysis of 164,000 workers' digital work activity. This tracked more than 443 million hours of work across over 1,000 employers. So this is one of the biggest studies on AI's effects on work. And what it showed is that the time, kind of the opposite of what the optimists were predicting. The time employees spent on email, messaging, and chat apps actually more than doubled, and so did their use of other business management tools. But the time that they had to do just distraction-free, uninterrupted work, which is really the kind you need to be productive and to produce at work, fell 9%. It didn't change for non-users. So some quotes from the article that I think are notable is that, of course, it's not what all of the AI evangelists had predicted, but here's one CEO who said, what we're finding is that the work is out there and it seems unbounded. And the appetite is to do more, not go home at noon. So yes, it's increasing productivity, but if an AI tool can just knock out a project in a few seconds, it would have taken you much longer. The inclination for both the employee and especially for the employer isn't to say, okay, well, day's done. It's like, well, no, let's do more. So people end up doing more. And over time, this can lead to cognitive overload, burnout, poorer decision-making, and declining work quality, even if it appears to be more productive in the short term. So again, 80% of employees are now using these tools at work. Maybe that includes you, and maybe you're hearing this and you're nodding along saying, yep, that's what I'm finding. So I want to bring this up and to add a Christian perspective to it. I really don't think this should surprise us when we think about human nature, because we tend to not like human limits. And one of the critiques or things that I think we should be thinking about when it comes to AI tools is not necessarily how productive can this make me. I think that question reveals an idolatry of productivity. It reminds me of Genesis and the Tower of Babel. Look at how much we as human beings can do. We can reach heaven. And so I've seen articles like this where people say, wow, I'm using these AI agents. They're doing all these things for me. It's like I have 1,000 little agents taking care of more things that I could ever manage on my own. My question is, maybe do you think you should be managing that much? Or is that are you trying to cheat, so to speak, and take credit for more work than you're actually able to do on your own instead of living within your sphere of influence that the Lord has given you? Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I just think that's a question we could ask. Another question that we should ask, and this is something else I posted at pointofview.net, so I'll just leave you with this. This is from Dr. Brad East. He's at ACU. He's a professor there, and I've interviewed him several times on the Know Why podcast, but he really says that we need to know how to ask the right questions about AI and any sort of tool, any new tool, digital tool, anything that appears to us and we say, well, should we use it? And he says the questions we should ask are moral, theological, and formational. What kind of person is this likely to make me to be? Will it develop virtues or vices? Will it expand and enrich my humanity, or will it not? So he says we shouldn't just say, well, here's a new tool. How should we use it? And that is the prominent question that a lot of people are asking. But as Christians, should we use it? How does this interact with us in the way that we were designed? Should we use it in this particular way or in this particular role or job or ministry? And so if you want a little bit more about that, to just kind of add a biblical perspective to these questions that we're all asking, I encourage you to check out that article at pointofview.net. Kirby will be back with you tomorrow. He'll have some great interviews and news topics to cover, of course, and it has been great to be with you today on Point of View. Don't forget to check out anything you missed at pointofview.net. Thank you to Megans, both of you, for being with me and producing the show today, and I hope that you have a wonderful Monday. We'll see you here tomorrow on Point of View.
It was President Ronald Reagan who said, "I wonder sometimes why we won't recognize that one book could solve a lot of problems for us." He was talking, of course, about God's Word. It holds the solution to our problems because it holds the truth. Did you know that between 2024 and 25 there was a surge in Bible reading among Americans? At last, people are seeing through culture's lies. They're tired of the moral confusion. They're seeking truth that they can live by. March 23rd kicks off Truth Team Week, a special time when Point of View highlights the impact of Truth Team members on our culture. But you don't have to wait to make a difference. You can join the Truth Team today. Help Americans find the truth they need. Visit pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151 to learn more. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.